My name is Megan. I am 29 years old, and I teach special education at a public middle school. Last spring, I went to my half-sister's dinner party celebrating our father's retirement. I wore a plain blue dress and kept mostly to myself. But at some point during the evening, my half-sister stood up, gestured toward me across the table, and said with a little laugh, "Oh, that's just Megan. She's a teacher. Special ed, actually." A few people smiled politely. Someone changed the subject almost immediately. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and picked up my glass of water. But across the room, a man I didn't recognize had stopped mid-conversation. He was staring at me the way people stare when they're trying to place a face they haven't seen in a long time. And before the night was over, he would say something that changed the entire energy of that room. But before I get into that, let me give you some background. My father worked as an engineer for 32 years. He was methodical, quiet, and genuinely decent. When I was 11, he and my mother divorced. It wasn't dramatic, no screaming, no court battles. They just grew into different people and decided the kindest thing they could do for each other was to stop pretending otherwise. My father remarried a few years later. His second wife, Diane, was warm enough to me when my father was in the room. When he wasn't, she was mostly indifferent. Her daughter from her first marriage was named Ashley. Ashley was 3 years older than me, and from the beginning, she had a way of reminding me without ever saying it directly that I was a guest in that version of my father's life, not a permanent resident. Growing up, Ashley had things I didn't. Private school, a car for her 16th birthday, a college fund that covered everything. I don't say that with bitterness, because my mother made sure I had what I needed. But the difference was always there, quiet and persistent, like a hum you eventually stop noticing but never actually disappears. I went to a state university on a partial scholarship and worked weekends at a coffee shop for the rest. I majored in special education because during my sophomore year I volunteered at a summer program for kids with learning differences, and something about that work just fit me in a way nothing else had before. I can't explain it any better than that. It felt like the first time I was doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing. I graduated, got certified, and started teaching at Roosevelt Middle School in our city. My caseload included students with dyslexia, ADHD, processing disorders, and autism spectrum diagnoses. The work was hard. Some days were genuinely exhausting in a way that reached down into your bones, but I loved it. I loved the small wins that most people would walk past without noticing, the kid who finally read a paragraph out loud without stopping. The student who made eye contact for the first time after months of careful, patient work. Those moments were mine, and I held on to them. Ashley, meanwhile, had built a very different life. She married a man named Brandon who ran a commercial real estate company. They lived in a large house in a newer part of town, drove expensive cars, and hosted the kind of parties where people stood around comparing investment strategies. Ashley had worked in marketing for a while, but stopped when they started having children. Now her primary occupation seemed to be managing appearances, which she was genuinely talented at. The house was always immaculate, the parties were always catered, and Ashley always looked like she had just stepped out of somewhere important. Our relationship had never been close. We weren't hostile, exactly. We were just two people who happened to share a father and not much else. She was polite to me at holidays and occasionally sent a text on my birthday. I did the same. It was civil. It was distant. It worked fine. When my father announced his retirement, Ashley immediately volunteered to host the celebration dinner. Of course she did. She loved any occasion that required her to organize something impressive. She sent out a formal invitation actually printed on cardstock, which felt a little excessive for a family dinner, but that was Ashley. The note said it would be an intimate gathering with family and a few of my father's closest friends and former colleagues. About 30 people total. I almost didn't go. I had a stack of IEP documents to finish over that weekend, and I knew exactly how those evenings at Ashley's house tended to make me feel. But my father had called me personally the week before, which he rarely did. He said he was really hoping I'd be there. So I said yes, finished what I could of the paperwork on Friday night, and drove over on Saturday evening in my plain blue dress. The house looked the way it always did, like a photograph of a house rather than an actual home. Flowers arranged on every surface. Soft lighting that somehow made everyone look better than they actually felt. A catered spread along one wall that included cheeses I couldn't identify and a signature cocktail with a little card explaining what was in it. My father was standing near the fireplace when I arrived, and he gave me a long hug and told me he was glad I came, and for a moment I remembered why I had said yes. I found a seat at one of the long tables near the middle of the room. Around me were some of my father's former colleagues, a few neighbors of Ashley's I didn't know, some cousins I had only seen twice in the past decade, and on the far side of the table, a couple I didn't recognize at all. The man was probably in his mid-50s, with a calm, careful way of holding himself. His wife sat beside him, engaged in a quiet conversation with one of my aunts. I thought they might be friends of Brandon's. For the first hour, everything was pleasant enough. My father made a short speech about what 32 years at one company had taught him, and it was genuinely thoughtful. A couple of his old colleagues told embarrassing stories from the early 90s. Someone cried a little. It was the kind of evening that would have been entirely nice if I hadn't been paying attention to Ashley. She moved through the room the way she always did at her own parties, slightly elevated, always aware of where the most important guests were standing. I watched her introduce my father to the couple I didn't recognize, watched her lean in and say something that made them both smile. She was good at this. I had never denied that. At some point, the main course was served, and people settled into their seats for the meal. Ashley tapped a fork against her glass to get everyone's attention. She made a short, polished toast to my father, warm, well-worded, and clearly prepared in advance. People applauded. My father looked moved. Then Ashley glanced around the table with the kind of bright, expansive smile she used when she wanted everyone in the room to feel included. She said she wanted to take a moment to introduce a few people for those who hadn't met everyone yet. She went around the table, a former department head, an old family friend, a cousin who had flown in from out of state. And then she turned her gaze to me. "Megan," she said, using the same warm tone she had just used for everyone else. She paused just a half second too long. "Megan is my stepsister." She gestured toward me. "She's a teacher." Ashley smiled. "Middle school special ed, actually." The way she said it was precise, not cruel enough to cause a scene. Just flat enough to land. The pause before actually did most of the work. It was the vocal equivalent of a small shrug, like she was completing a sentence she found slightly tiresome. A woman across the table made a soft sound that might have been polite acknowledgement, or might have been the beginning of a conversation she was already more interested in. Someone else reached for the bread basket. The moment passed the way those moments always do, fast enough that calling it out would have made me look oversensitive, slow enough that everyone at the table had registered it. I smiled. I said something like, "Nice to meet everyone." I picked up my fork. I was used to this. Ashley had a talent for making small cuts that left no visible marks. I had been on the receiving end of them since I was 11 years old, and I had learned that reacting was always worse than not reacting. So I kept my face calm and my posture easy, and I told myself what I had told myself many times before, that what she thought of my job said nothing about my job, and everything about her. What I did not expect was what happened next. The man I didn't recognize, the one sitting on the far side of the table, the one with the calm, careful way of carrying himself, had gone very still. I noticed it because he had been in an easy conversation with my aunt just a few seconds earlier, and now he wasn't. He was looking at me. Not the way people look at someone they find interesting. The way people look at someone they are trying to remember. I glanced back at my plate. When I looked up again a minute later, he was still doing it. His wife noticed and touched his arm lightly. He turned to her briefly, said something quiet, and she nodded. But then he looked back at me again. There was something in his expression that wasn't rude, it was concentrated, the way you look when a word you know perfectly well has temporarily gone missing from your mind. Ashley was talking about the renovation she and Brandon were doing on the back porch. Several guests were engaged. My father was listening and smiling. The room had its own comfortable rhythm going, but this man was still working through something. Before I tell you what he eventually said, I want to be honest with you about something. I don't tell this story because I want you to think I'm extraordinary. I tell it because I think about the students I've worked with, and the parents who have cried in my classroom, and the colleagues who eat lunch at their desks because there isn't enough time, and I think they deserve to have this story exist somewhere in the world. So please take a second to like this video and subscribe to HeartPath Stories if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It means more than you know. Now, let me finish telling you what happened. The man finally set down his fork. He leaned forward slightly in his chair and addressed me directly, in a voice that was polite but clear enough for the immediate stretch of table to hear. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm sorry to interrupt." He paused. "Did you say you teach at a middle school?" I said yes, Roosevelt Middle, over on the east side. He nodded slowly. "Special education?" "Yes," I said. He looked at me for another moment with that same concentrated expression. Then he said, "What's your last name?" I told him. He sat back in his chair. The recognition that moved across his face was quiet and complete, like a light being switched on in a room that had been dark for a while. His wife was watching him now, so were the two people sitting closest to him. He looked at me and said, I think he paused, choosing his words carefully, "I think you may have taught my son." The table went a little quieter around us. I asked him his son's name. When he said it, I knew immediately. I felt it in my chest before my mind had fully caught up. His name was Daniel. He had been in my class 3 years earlier, during what the school had classified as one of the most challenging academic placements they had tried to make in several years. Daniel was 12 when I met him, nonverbal in most traditional classroom settings, with a profile that a lot of good educators, well-meaning educators had quietly given up on before he ever reached middle school. His file had notes in it that I remember reading on my first day with him, and I remember thinking, whoever wrote these didn't see him correctly. That is not a criticism. These things are complicated, and everyone was doing their best. But I had a different read on Daniel from the beginning. His father was looking at me the way you look at someone who appeared in a chapter of your life that still catches you off guard when you think about it. I said yes. I remembered Daniel very well. And the man said, "Then you know what you did." The table was quiet now. Not just the people immediately around us, the room had that particular quality of stillness that happens when multiple conversations taper off at the same moment without anyone planning it. Ashley had stopped talking about the porch renovation. The man took a breath. He spoke to the table, not just to me, in the measured way of someone who had told this story before but still felt the weight of it every time. He explained that his son had spent years being moved through systems that didn't know what to do with him. That by the time Daniel reached middle school, his parents had been told gently, professionally, with all the appropriate softening language that his prospects for independent communication were limited. That they should focus on quality of life and practical daily skills and try not to anchor too many hopes to academic milestones. He said they had accepted that. They were not people who gave up easily, but they were also not people who could watch their child suffer through repeated failures in pursuit of a goal that multiple professionals had told them was unlikely. So they had adjusted what they hoped for. They had made peace with it, the way parents do when they love their children more than they love the idea of who their children might have been. And then, he said, Daniel was placed in my class. He said I had called him and his wife in for a meeting about 6 weeks into the school year. He said he had gone and braced for another conversation about limitations and realistic expectations. That he and his wife had held hands in the parking lot before walking in, the way they always did before those meetings, because they had learned that was what they needed to do. He said instead I had shown them a video on my laptop. It was a recording I had made of Daniel during a one-on-one session using an augmentative communication device and a method I had been adapting for about 2 years based on his specific learning profile. On the video, Daniel was answering questions. Not nodding. Not pointing. Answering, forming responses, choosing words, communicating with specificity and intention. He said his wife had started crying before the video was 30 seconds in. He said he had not been able to speak for several minutes. He said Daniel was now 15 and attending a mainstream classroom for 3 periods a day with support. that he had recently read a book report aloud to his class. That last month, he had told his father, using full sentences, that he wanted to be a marine biologist because he thought octopuses were the most intelligent animals on the planet and someone needed to be their advocate. He stopped. He looked at me very directly. He said, "My son told me he wanted to be someone's advocate. My son, who we were told would never communicate beyond a functional level." There was no sound at the table. Somewhere across the room, a piece of silverware touched a plate, and it rang out clearly in the quiet. He said, "And the reason my son can tell me what he wants to be when he grows up is sitting right there." He gestured toward me. I felt heat rise in my face. I am not someone who handles being looked at easily. There is an irony there, given that I spend my days in front of classrooms. But I could feel every person at that long table turned in my direction. My father was very still. I couldn't quite read his expression. Some of my relatives were exchanging looks that I couldn't interpret from where I was sitting. Ashley had not moved. She was looking at the center of the table with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger. Something quieter than that and harder to name. I said what I always say in moments like that. I said I was just doing my job. That Daniel had done the real work. That he had always been capable, he had just needed someone to find the right door. The man shook his head. He said, "You can say that if it makes you comfortable. But I want you to know that my wife and I have said your name in our home more times than you probably realize. That when Daniel does something new, something that surprises us, we still say to each other, 'Remember what Megan said in that first meeting? Remember what she saw in him?'" His wife, who had been quiet this whole time, reached across and put her hand briefly over mine where it rested on the table. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. My aunt, my father's sister, who had been sitting near them all evening, made a sound that was not quite a word, just a small exhale of something that had been building for a while. She shook her head slowly, not at anyone in particular. My father spoke then. His voice was even, which is how his voice always was, but I knew my father's even voice well enough to understand what was underneath it. He said he was glad I had come tonight. He was looking at me, not at Ashley. Then the man said something else. He said, and I want to be accurate here, because I have thought about these words many times since he said, when I heard someone introduced as just a teacher tonight. I'll be honest, something sat wrong with me. He said it calmly, without drama, without looking at Ashley. He said, "The people who get called just a teacher, just a social worker, just a school counselor, those are the people who are in the room when the systems everyone else built aren't enough. They're the ones still there when everything else has been tried." He picked up his glass. He said, "I don't know any other way to say this. My son has a future because of the woman sitting at this table, and that deserves to be said out loud." He raised his glass slightly, not in the theatrical way of a formal toast, but in the small, sincere way of someone who means a simple thing simply. A few people around the table lifted their glasses too. My cousin, who I hadn't spoken to properly in years, raised hers without hesitation and looked at me with an expression that was uncomplicated and warm. One of my father's former colleagues nodded and raised his glass and said something quietly approving to the person beside him. Ashley did not raise her glass. I don't say that to be unkind. I say it because it's true, and because what I remember most about the rest of that evening was not the discomfort I had walked in carrying or the little cut that had been made over dinner. What I remember most is how the room felt after that moment. The way people spoke to me differently, not with exaggerated deference, not with the slightly embarrassed overcorrection of people who feel caught out. Just differently. Like I had become more fully visible. A woman I had never met before introduced herself to me properly and asked genuine questions about my work. One of my father's old colleagues told me his granddaughter had recently been diagnosed with dyslexia, and could I recommend anything, and we talked for nearly 20 minutes. My aunt sat with me for a while at the end of one of the tables and didn't say much, just kept her hand near mine the way she used to when I was small. Daniel's father found me again before the evening ended. He said Daniel was now in a school play. He pulled up a photo on his phone, a kid with an enormous smile standing in a costume that was slightly too big, looking directly at the camera with the particular confidence of a person who has recently discovered they have something to say. I looked at that photo for a long time. I told him Daniel looked wonderful. I meant it all the way down. He said, "He is. He really is." Ashley was quiet for the rest of the evening. She kept things moving, thanked the caterers, made sure everyone had what they needed, said the right things to the right people as they left. She was competent and composed and utterly in control, the way she always was at her own events. But she didn't come back to my end of the table, and she didn't look at me directly for the rest of the night. I drove home at around 10 o'clock. I sat in my car in my own driveway for a while before going inside. Not because I was sad, not because I was angry. I was just thinking about Daniel at 12, alone with a file full of other people's conclusions about what he could and couldn't do. I was thinking about his parents in that parking lot, holding hands before another meeting. I was thinking about all the students on my current caseload and whether the people in their lives were seeing them correctly and what it would mean if someone didn't. I do this work because it matters. Not because it pays well, it doesn't. Not nearly enough. Not because it comes with status or recognition, because mostly it doesn't come with those things either. I do this work because every single child in my classroom is someone's entire world, and they deserve someone who sees that and acts accordingly. Every single day, without needing anyone to raise a glass. But I will say this, there is something that happens when the truth about your work gets spoken out loud in a room full of people who assumed they already knew what you were. Something small and structural shifts. Not in your sense of your own worth that has to be built somewhere quieter and more private, but in the room, in the way the air moves. I thought about Daniel saying he wanted to be an advocate for octopuses. I thought about how seriously he had meant it. And then I went inside, made tea, and finished my IEP paperwork. Because the work doesn't pause. And honestly, that's the part I love most. What other people think of your job is not your job. Your job is your job. And sometimes, it just takes one evening for an entire room to finally understand the difference.